Now, Professor Andrews, in your interview with James Warner Wallace, you said, "In my role as an apologist, apart from writing a number of books, I may have been the first creationist to debate Richard Dawkins." So as one of the first creationists to debate Richard Dawkins, Professor Andrews, what do you think is the strongest argument that Richard Dawkins has presented for the evolutionary theory, and why do you believe that it remains insufficient as evidence for the evolutionary theory?
I find that question difficult to answer because I don't think Richard Dawkins actually makes arguments. He makes assertions and builds on those assertions. Of course, you can define an argument any way you like, but in my view, a valid argument involves two essential qualities, if you like, two essential ingredients. A valid argument must first of all begin with a true or at least rational premise starting point. And the second ingredient that is necessary to a valid argument is that as the argument develops, alternatives must be considered and rejected as necessary, but they must be considered, they must be taken into account, and the one presenting the argument has to tell us why the alternatives are wrong. And now, I don't find that in Richard Dawkins at all, and he does use the principle of asserting things without justifying them, and then building his ideas on top of that. Let me give an example of his genre of argument. He argues that, first of all, complicated things are less probable than uncomplicated things. He starts at that point, and that can be true in some narrow areas. It's true in statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, perhaps, but it's certainly not true as a generalization. In fact, it's ridiculous as a generalization. You go to any arbitrary place on the earth and start digging, you're far more likely to find earthworms than you are diamonds. And yet a diamond is a very simple thing. It is a single crystal of a single element, carbon. Earthworms, on the other hand, are very complicated organisms. And so you can't say that just because something is complicated, it is uncommon and therefore improbable. So his starting point is false. And then he goes on to argue that the universe is very complicated, and therefore, if God created the universe, then God must be even more complicated, and moves on to the conclusion that God is very improbable. Well, once again, he fails entirely on the second score. He fails to consider alternatives. He says that because the universe is complicated, any creator of the universe would have to be more complicated. That doesn't follow in any way. He doesn't consider the alternative that the creator of the universe might, in fact, be simpler than the universe. And the God of the Bible, a God of theism, is in fact, in some ways, a very simple entity. He is spirit. Therefore, he doesn't have any moving parts, if you'll excuse that expression. Doesn't have any material parts at all. He's not a conglomeration of machines and gears and mechanisms. He is just a spirit. And that is very uncomplicated, a unitary spirit. And so by failing to consider alternatives, Dawkins violates my second principle of the valid argument. Now, if we just move away from Dawkins for a moment and say, among atheists generally, what is the most powerful argument in favor of evolution? I would say, well, quite clearly, it is the fact that all living creatures, as far as we know, all living things, all life forms, share the same genetic code. So the common genetic code, whether they be bacteria or higher animals, more advanced organisms, genetic code. And that, I think, is the most powerful argument. The most powerful argument used to be thought, in my younger days as a Christian, that the fossil record was a very powerful argument. But although nobody seems to have noticed, that was shot down by paleontologists who in fact study the fossils, that is their specialization. And there is a theory that was put forward by Stephen Jay Gould and others that evolution has still happened, but it happened off stage. It happened in small areas and small populations which didn't leave any fossils. And then when the evolution had occurred, it burst out and became widespread. And why did he propose that theory, that alternative theory? Well, he did it because as a paleontologist, he knew very well that the fossil record does not correspond to the evolutionary narrative of continual, gradual change and transformation from one species to another, from one type of animal to another. It's not supported by the fossil record. And so he invented this alternative theory, which is called punctuated equilibrium, meaning that fossils in the fossil record appear suddenly, continue unchanged except for minor adaptations, and then disappear, or else they're still with us today. And so that was the equilibrium. Fossils don't change in the fossil record. They appear, they disappear, they undergo certain modifications, that's not a problem, but they don't evolve gradually from one type of animal to another. So you say, well, that was happening off stage. And that's his answer to it. It's not widely accepted by evolutionists, of course, but it just illustrates that something that was once considered probably the best evidence for evolution has now gone out of fashion. Well, now what about this idea? Well, the fact that all living things have a common genetic code. Well, first of all, of course, they can't tell us where the genetic code came from. Codes don't happen by accident. And I argue that in my book, Who Made God, at great length. But the failure there, the premise of the argument that all living things have a common genetic code, that's fine, that's accepted, nobody disputes that. So the premise is correct and acceptable, but they don't consider alternatives. The alternatives, of course, are divine creation, a common pattern of life, because that's the way God made life. He made all life in the same way. Or the intelligent design movement, who don't attribute creation to God, but point out that the scientific evidence shows that there must have been a mind, there must have been an intelligence behind the development of life, and that is the only way that one can account for the scientific findings. but they don't consider them because they immediately say, well, that's not science. Well, no, it isn't science. But then that means they are saying science is the only reservoir depository of reality. Only science can describe reality. Reality finishes when you move outside of the material realm, which is what science investigates. Well, that is just an opinion. It's not based upon any evidence itself. So the story of common descent is the only one left if you rule out non-material causes. But why do you rule out non-material causes? You rule them out because you don't like them. I don't think I am in any way worried by or persuaded by or troubled by the best answers that evolutionists can give for the correctness of their theory. I would like to just add this. We must distinguish between the molecules to man common descent theory, where all life is derived from some single spark of life, and what we might call microevolution, which I think would be better called adaptation, in which a given species or pre-evolution is no problem for the creationist or for the intelligent design proponent. And in fact, it's paralleled by human breeding of animals where you can breed an amazing range of different varieties of cats and dogs, but they're still cats and dogs. I don't think I need to elaborate on that.